The moment Ryan asked for my call sign, I watched a man who had spent 30 years in the teeth of America's most classified operations set down his fork like it had suddenly turned to lead. He didn't ask twice. He didn't need to. My brother-in-law kept smiling that easy, superior smile of his, the one he'd worn all through dinner, completely unaware that he'd just walked into a room he didn't understand. I said one word, and the temperature at that table dropped 10 degrees. I hadn't planned on any of it happening that night. I'd shown up to my in-laws' house in a plain cotton sweater and jeans, carrying a bottle of Pinot Noir, and the kind of tired that comes from 3 back-to-back watch rotations, hoping for nothing more than a quiet meal and an early night. My husband David had warned me his brother would be there. He always said it the same way, half apology, half bracing himself. Ryan Foster had a gift for making every room about Ryan Foster, and family dinners were his favorite stage. He was already holding court when we walked in, a glass of bourbon in one hand, recounting some story about a training exercise off the coast of Virginia, like he'd personally turned the tide of a war. Ryan was a Lieutenant 03 surface warfare, and to his credit, he'd worked hard to get there. But somewhere along the way, hard work had curdled into something else, a hunger to be seen as the family's real success story, the one who'd traded a soft civilian life for something dangerous and honorable. He needed an audience. He needed a foil. For years, without ever asking my permission, I had been that foil. I never talked about my work. Not because I was being coy, and not because I enjoyed the mystery, though I'll admit there were nights I found the silence almost restful. I simply couldn't. 14 years and most of what I'd done didn't belong to me to tell. It belonged to the men and women who'd trusted me with their lives, in rooms with no windows on ships that didn't officially exist in certain waters on certain nights. So when people asked, I gave them the truthful, unsatisfying answer. Administrative work, some logistics, nothing exciting. It cost me nothing to let them believe it. Or so I thought. Dinner started the way it always did, with Ryan's mother fussing over the roast, and his father pouring wine like he was rationing gold, and Ryan working the table like it was a promotion board. He'd made captain of his own narrative a long time ago. Tonight's material was a joint exercise he'd just returned from, and he told it well. I'll give him that. The tension, the coordination the moment his ship held formation through weather that would have turned most stomachs inside out. People leaned in. David squeezed my hand under the table, the small apologetic gesture he always made when his brother got going, like he could absorb some of it for me. Then, Ryan's eyes drifted to me, sitting quiet at the far end, near his father's old friend, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair, and the stillness of someone who'd spent a career learning not to move unless it mattered. Ryan smirked the way he always did right before he said something he thought was clever. "You're in the Navy too, right?" He let the pause hang there just long enough to be cruel. "Let me guess, I bet you've never even been on a real mission." The table laughed, that easy, complicit laugh families give the loudest voice in the room. David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing because saying something had never worked before, and we both knew it. I didn't rise to it. I never did. I just smiled the same closed, patient smile I'd worn through 100 rooms like this one, and reached for my water glass. That's when the old man at the head of the table lifted his eyes. He'd been quiet all evening, the kind of quiet that isn't absence but attention. And until that moment, I'd assumed he was simply tired, an old friend of my father-in-law's along for the ride. He set down his fork. He looked at me, really looked the way you look at someone when a piece of your memory is trying to surface and match a face to it. And he asked the question no one at that table had any reason to ask. "What's your call sign?" For a second, just a second, something in my chest went still. It wasn't fear. It was the strange vertigo of 2 separate lives touching for the first time in a room where they were never supposed to meet. I felt David go rigid beside me. I felt Ryan's smirk hovering, waiting for whatever punchline he assumed was coming. "Sentinel Tain," I said. The old man didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply set his fork down against the plate with a small, deliberate click, the sound of a door quietly closing on Ryan's version of the evening. Ryan's laugh died somewhere in his throat. Nobody else at the table understood what had just happened, why the air had changed, why his father's old friend was suddenly sitting up straighter, studying me like I was a name he'd read in a file he was never supposed to see twice. David's hand found mine again. Tighter this time, and I felt him glance at me with a question he wouldn't ask until we were alone in the car. Ryan recovered first, the way he always did, papering over the silence with another joke that landed flat. But something had shifted, and even he could feel it, even if he didn't yet know what it was. As the plates were cleared and the conversation limped back to safer ground, he leaned toward me one last time, that old confidence flickering back into his voice. "Maybe one day you'll see what the real Navy looks like," he said almost gently, like he was doing me a favor. I only smiled. "Maybe," I said. I didn't tell him I'd been living in the real Navy since before he'd finished his first deployment brief. Some things you don't explain. You let them find their own way to the surface. And that night, driving home with David quiet beside me, and the old man's eyes still burning somewhere in the back of my mind, I had the distinct feeling that mine already had. The call came the next morning while I was standing at my kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me, half listening to David explain to our son why his socks didn't match. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, a Virginia area code, and something in me, some old, well-worn instinct, told me to step outside onto the back porch before I answered. "Commander Foster." The voice was unmistakable gravel wrapped in discipline. "This is Walt Reyes. We met last night. I hope I'm not calling too early." I set my mug down on the porch railing. "Master Chief Reyes," I said, and I heard him exhale on the other end like a man confirming a suspicion he'd been carrying since the moment I said one word at that dinner table. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Walt Reyes, it turned out, had spent the better part of 3 decades as a Command Master Chief attached to Naval Special Operations, the kind of career that doesn't show up on a resume because most of it never officially happened. He told me carefully, the way men like him always speak when they're picking their words off a very short list of things they're allowed to say, that he'd recognized something in my voice the moment I answered his question. Not the call sign itself, the way I'd said it, flat, practiced. The particular reluctance of someone who'd been trained to give up information only when it served a purpose. "You were with Task Group 7, he said. It wasn't really a question. I stood there on my porch watching a cardinal work its way along the fence line, and I felt the strange, familiar tightening that came whenever the wall between my 2 lives thinned even slightly. "I can't confirm assignments, Master Chief. You know that better than anyone." "I do," he said, and there was something almost warm in it, a kind of respect that didn't need me to say another word. "I just wanted you to know I knew exactly who I was sitting across from last night, and I understand why nobody else at that table did." We talked a little longer, carefully, the way 2 people talk when they share a language most people around them have never learned. He asked about my current posting in the vaguest possible terms, and I gave him vague possible answers, and somewhere in that careful dance, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For years I had carried the particular loneliness of being fully known by almost no one, of walking through my own family's holidays and cookouts as a kind of half-person, present but not visible. Walt Reyes didn't need my file. He already understood the shape of the years I couldn't discuss the deployments with no port of call listed anywhere. The medals that existed only in a drawer. Nobody else was cleared to open the version of me that surfaced only in the presence of people who'd stood in rooms like the ones I'd stood in. "Sentinel," he said again almost to himself before we hung up, and I could hear him shaking his head slightly, the way you do when a rumor turns out to be true. I heard stories about Sentinel. Didn't expect to be passing the mashed potatoes to her. After we hung up, I stood on the porch a long moment, turning the conversation over. It should have felt like nothing, an old sailor recognizing an old call sign, a coincidence of small world connections that happen constantly in a service as tight-knit as ours. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like a thread had been pulled, however gently, and I had learned enough about threads to know they rarely stop at one tug. Inside, David was watching me through the kitchen window, his expression unreadable in the particular way it got whenever my other life brushed up against our ordinary one. He didn't ask who'd called. He'd learned over 11 years of marriage exactly which questions I could answer and which ones I couldn't, and he'd made peace with the boundary long before I ever had to draw it for him. It was one of the quiet reasons I loved him. He never made me choose between honesty and honor. He simply waited on the other side of the line I couldn't cross, patient, present mine. Ryan, of course, was not so restrained. I heard about it from David 2 days later, delivered with the weary half-smile he always wore when relaying his brother's latest performance. Ryan had been telling the story of Saturday's dinner all over town, to his buddies at the base, to his fiancée's parents, even apparently to a stranger at the gym, recasting the moment with Reyes as some minor curiosity rather than the small earthquake it had actually been. "Some old guy got confused," he'd said, laughing it off, though David suspected his brother had spent more than a few hours turning the moment over in private, unable to fully shake it. Ryan didn't like mysteries he wasn't the center of. He liked them even less when they involved me. It was David who told me almost apologetically that Ryan had decided to invite us to the Navy Heritage Gala the following month. A formal affair, dress whites admirals and their spouses, the kind of event where careers were quietly measured against one another over champagne. Ryan had never invited me to anything like it before. I understood immediately why he was doing it now. "He wants people to see the difference," David said, carefully watching my face for a reaction I didn't give him. "Between his life and yours, he wants to prove something." I only nodded, feeling that same old patient stillness settle over me, the one I'd learned a long time ago in far less comfortable rooms than his parents' dining room. Ryan wanted an audience for the moment he finally put me in my place. I had no objection to giving him one. "Tell him we'll be there," I said. David studied me for a long moment, the way he always did when he sensed the tide shifting beneath calm water. "You're sure?" I picked my coffee back up cold now and didn't mind. "I've never missed a gala in my life," I said. "I'm not about to start with this one." The ballroom at the Heritage Gala smelled like polished brass and orchids, the particular perfume of an evening built to impress. Chandeliers threw soft gold light across a sea of dress whites and gowns, and somewhere a string quartet worked its way through something classical and forgettable, the kind of music meant to fill silence without demanding attention. I stood near the bar in my own dress uniform ribbons in their proper rows, feeling the familiar weight of an evening I'd attended 100 times before in 100 different cities, though never quite like this. Ryan found us within minutes of our arrival, resplendent in his own whites, working the room the way some men work a job interview that never ends. He had a gift for it. I'll admit, the easy handshake, the practiced laugh, the way he angled his shoulders to make sure the right people saw him talking to the other right people. David hung back at my side, quiet in the particular way he got at these events, watching his brother orbit the room like a man determined to burn through every ounce of goodwill he had before the night was over. It didn't take Ryan long to find his opening. He steered a cluster of junior officers toward us with the practiced ease of a man introducing a punchline. "This is my sister-in-law," he said, clapping a hand briefly on my shoulder like I was a display piece. "She's Navy too, mostly office work, though paperwork, scheduling, that sort of thing." He said it lightly, almost kindly, the way you might describe a hobby rather than a career, and the group nodded politely, the way people do when they have no reason to doubt what they're told, and no particular interest in questioning it further. I let it sit. There was no version of that room where correcting him would have served any purpose, and besides, I'd spent too many years letting people underestimate me to feel any real sting in it now. Ryan glanced my way once, checking for a reaction, and when he found none, something like satisfaction flickered across his face. He believed, I think, that my silence was proof of his story rather than the opposite. We'd barely finished our drinks when the room shifted. It wasn't loud the way these things rarely are, just a subtle change in posture, a ripple moving through clusters of officers near the entrance heads, turning toward the door with the particular deference reserved for rank. A rear admiral had arrived, silver-haired, broad, through the shoulders, the kind of presence that didn't need to raise its voice to command a room. Ryan straightened immediately, smoothing the front of his jacket, already calculating the angles of introduction. The admiral's eyes swept the room once the practiced scan of a man cataloging who mattered where, and then they stopped. On me. I felt David go still beside me. Ryan mid-sentence with one of the junior officers faltered as the admiral began walking not toward the cluster of senior staff gathering near the stage, not toward the base commander waiting with an outstretched hand, but directly toward us, cutting a clean line through the crowd like the rest of the room had simply ceased to exist. Commander Foster. His hand was already extended before he reached me, and I took it, feeling the eyes of the entire circle around us swing in our direction like a compass, finding north. His grip was firm, familiar. The handshake of a man who'd shared far more with me than a ballroom floor. Good to see Sentinel again. The name landed in that room like a dropped glass. I felt it ripple outward in real time, the junior officers exchanging glances. Someone near the bar turning fully around, and Ryan still holding his own drink halfway to his mouth, freezing entirely. The practiced ease draining out of his posture like water through a cracked glass. "Admiral," I said, keeping my voice even the tone I'd used in 100 briefings where showing surprise was its own kind of failure. "It's good to see you, too." He held my hand a beat longer than protocol required, studying my face with something between warmth and quiet reverence. "I heard you'd transferred stateside. Didn't expect to run into you at a gala of all places." He glanced briefly at Ryan, at David, taking in the family resemblance without needing an introduction, and something in his expression suggested he understood far more about the dynamic in front of him than anyone had told him. "You're in good company tonight, I hope." "I am," I said, and left it there. He didn't linger long. Men at his level rarely could pull always toward the next obligation, the next hand to shake, but before he moved on, he turned back to me one more time. His voice pitched just low enough to feel private, and just loud enough to be heard by everyone still watching. "The Navy doesn't forget what you did out there, Commander, neither do I." Then he was gone, swallowed back into the current of the room, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than the quartet still playing somewhere in the background. I turned my attention back to my drink, unbothered, while around me the temperature of the evening quietly, irrevocably changed. Ryan hadn't moved. He stood there with his glass forgotten in his hand, staring at the space where the Admiral had been, then at me, then back again, like a man trying to reconcile two versions of a story that could no longer both be true. The junior officers he'd been so eager to impress a moment earlier were now looking at me with an entirely different kind of attention. Not polite indifference, but genuine, unguarded curiosity. "Sentinel," one of them said quietly, almost to himself, testing the word like he was trying to remember where he'd heard it. "Wait, that Sentinel—" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Across the circle, I watched something in Ryan's face begin for the first time in longer than I could remember to crack. The days after the gala had a strange texture to them, like weather that hadn't decided what it wanted to be. Ryan didn't call. He didn't bring it up at the next family dinner either, though I caught him watching me across the table more than once, his eyes narrowed in the particular way of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. David noticed it too. He mentioned almost in passing that his brother had gone quiet in a way that wasn't like him at all, Ryan, who filled every silence with a story, suddenly choosing his words like a man picking his way across ice. It didn't last. I should have known better than to think a moment of humility would hold. Ryan wasn't built for uncertainty. He was built for control, for being the loudest, most decorated voice in any room he walked into, and the gala had knocked something loose in him that he couldn't simply let settle. A week later, David told me his brother had started asking questions, quiet ones at first, to friends stationed at the Pentagon, to an old classmate now working personnel records, fishing for whatever he could find about a lieutenant commander named Samantha Foster. I wasn't angry when I heard it. If anything, I understood it better than he ever could have guessed. Ryan had spent his entire adult life measuring his worth against a scoreboard only he could see, and for years I had occupied a strange, unthreatening space on that board, a quiet in-law easy to dismiss, easy to be better than. The Admiral's handshake had knocked me off that space entirely, and Ryan, more than anything, needed to know where I actually belonged, because not knowing meant he couldn't measure himself against me anymore. That kind of uncertainty was, for a man like him, worse than losing outright. What he found, or rather didn't find, only made it worse. He'd gone in expecting a paper trail assignments deployment, some tidy record he could hold up and compare against his own. Instead, every inquiry he made ran into the same quiet wall. Task Group 7 pulled nothing beyond a name and a redacted mission summary. Requests for further detail came back with a single line: cold and absolute access denied. Even his classmate, a man with reasonable clearance and reasonable connections, told him flatly that whatever I'd been part of sat several levels above anything he was authorized to see, and that continuing to push might draw exactly the kind of attention Ryan didn't actually want drawn to himself. David relayed all this to me carefully one evening after the kids were asleep, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with the particular caution of a man delivering news he wasn't sure how I'd take. "He thinks you're exaggerating," David said, "or that people are just being polite to you because of who you're married to." He paused. I told him that wasn't it. He didn't want to hear it. I wasn't surprised. It's a strange thing watching someone choose disbelief over a truth that's inconvenient to their own story. Ryan had built an entire identity on being the family's proof of American courage, the one who'd traded comfort for consequence, and admitting that a woman he'd spent years quietly dismissing might have done more, seen more, carried more than he ever had. That wasn't a truth he could simply absorb over dinner. It would have required him to rebuild something in himself, and rebuilding is always harder than digging in. So he dug in. I heard through the grapevine of family gossip that always seemed to find its way to me eventually that Ryan had started telling a new version of events. Not that I'd lied exactly, he wasn't foolish enough to accuse me outright, but that the Admiral's greeting had been a courtesy, a friendly nod between people who'd crossed paths once, nothing more. That sentinel was probably some minor call sign from a training rotation, blown out of proportion by an old man's failing memory and a room full of people eager for drama. He said it convincingly enough that a few relatives nodded along, relieved, I think, to have a simpler story to hold on to than the one sitting quietly across their dinner table. I let him have it. There was no version of confronting him that would have served any purpose beyond my own satisfaction, and satisfaction had never been the point. What Ryan didn't understand, what men like him rarely understand until it's forced on them, is that the quietest people in a room are often quiet, because the truth doesn't need their volume to survive. I had spent 14 years being underestimated by people who mistook my silence for absence, and every single time, the silence had outlasted their certainty. Still, there were nights I lay awake beside David, staring at the ceiling, turning it over. Not because I doubted myself I'd earned every ribbon in that closet, every classified line in a file Ryan would never be cleared to read, but because I understood exactly where this was heading, and some small, tired part of me wished it didn't have to. Ryan wasn't simply going to let the mystery dissolve quietly into family legend. Men who need to win don't walk away from a hand they think they're still holding. He was going to force the issue publicly in front of people whose good opinion he valued more than mine, and when he did, there would be no controlling the shape of what came next. David must have sensed it too, because one night he reached over in the dark and found my hand without saying anything at all. He didn't ask me to soften it for his brother. He didn't ask me to explain myself or defend myself or perform some smaller version of the truth to keep the peace. He simply held on the way he always did, present on his side of the line I couldn't cross, waiting with a kind of faith I didn't always feel I deserved. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I already know who you are." I didn't answer. I just held his hand back and let the silence say what 14 years of classified missions had taught me it could say better than words ever would. Ryan chose the worst possible moment to force his hand, which in hindsight was exactly the kind of moment he always chose. His fiancée's family was hosting an engagement dinner at the officers' club near the base, a polished, high-ceilinged room full of white tablecloths, and low conversation populated by more brass than I'd expected for what was supposed to be a private family occasion. David told me later that Ryan had specifically requested a larger guest list than necessary: old commanding officers, a few visiting staff men whose opinions he'd spent years trying to earn. I understood the moment we walked in, and I saw the room exactly what kind of stage he'd built for himself. He waited until dessert. That was Ryan's style: never confront a person cold, always let the wine do half the work first, let the room grow warm and loose and unguarded before he made his move. I watched him stand, glass in hand, ostensibly to offer a toast to his fiancée, and felt the shift in his voice before he even turned toward me. There was a brightness to it, a performative ease that didn't match the tightness around his eyes. "Before we get to the happy stuff," he said, smiling around the table, "I want to clear something up, because I think everyone here deserves to know the truth." His eyes found mine, and for the first time all evening, the mask slipped just enough to show me what was underneath. Not confidence, but something closer to desperation, dressed up as confidence. "Sam, Why don't you tell everyone what you've actually done? No vague answers this time. No hiding behind classified. Just tell them. The room went quiet in that particular uncomfortable way rooms go quiet when someone has decided to turn a dinner into a trial. I felt David tense beside me. Felt the older officers at the far end of the table exchange the kind of glance that said they recognized exactly what was happening and didn't like it. I set my fork down unhurried and looked at Ryan for a long moment before I answered. "I can't do that," I said simply. "You know I can't." Ryan's smile widened sharp, now triumphant. He turned to the table like a lawyer delivering a closing argument. "Exactly," he said, spreading his hands. "That's what I'm saying. There's nothing to tell. It's always been a story, a mystery everyone wants to believe because it's more interesting than the truth. She works a desk job, folks. That's it. That's the whole thing." He laughed a short, satisfied sound, and lifted his glass like the matter was settled, like he'd finally, after months of quiet unraveling, wrestled the narrative back into his own hands. I didn't defend myself. I never had, and I wasn't going to start in a ballroom full of people who either already knew the truth or didn't need to. I simply held his gaze steady and let him have his moment, because I understood something Ryan never had, that a lie only holds as long as the silence around it stays undisturbed. The silence broke almost immediately. At the far end of the room near the entrance, a rear admiral I recognized from 3 separate briefings over the years had just stepped up to a small podium set up for the evening's formal toasts, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of what he was walking into. He'd barely begun his opening remarks, something gracious about the young couple, about tradition, about service, when his eyes caught mine across the room and the words simply stopped in his mouth. He didn't finish the sentence. He set down his notes and every head in the room turned to follow his gaze as he stepped down from the podium and began walking unhurried, deliberate, straight toward our table. Ryan's glass hovered halfway to his lips. I watched the blood drain slowly from his face as the realization crept over him second by second that this was not going to go the way he'd planned. "Commander Foster." The Admiral's voice carried easily across the now silent room. He extended his hand, and I stood to take it, feeling 200 pairs of eyes settle on us at once. He held onto my hand a moment longer than protocol required, then turned to face the room, still holding it, like he wanted everyone present to understand exactly what they were witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the particular gravity of a man who rarely spoke without purpose. "I don't know what's been said here tonight, but I want to say something myself. This officer has saved American lives more times than most of us in this room will ever know, in operations most of us will never be cleared to hear about. I've had the privilege of working alongside Commander Foster on 3 separate occasions, and I can tell you with absolute certainty there is no braver officer wearing this uniform tonight." The silence that followed was absolute. I felt Ryan beside me, utterly still, his glass forgotten, his carefully constructed narrative collapsing in real time, in front of the exact audience he'd assembled to destroy mine. His fiancée's mother pressed a hand to her mouth. Somewhere near the back, one of the older officers began quietly to clap, and within seconds the sound rippled outward until the entire room was on its feet. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I simply nodded once at the Admiral, thanked him quietly, and sat back down, aware of Ryan beside me, white as the tablecloth, staring at his own hands like he no longer recognized them. David reached under the table and found mine, gripping it hard, and I felt for the first time in a long while something loosen in my chest, not triumph exactly, but the quiet, unhurried satisfaction of a truth that had simply finally been allowed to stand on its own. News like that doesn't stay contained to one room. By the following week, the story of the engagement dinner had made its way through the base in the particular unstoppable way these things always do, not through any effort of mine, but through the officers who'd been there, men who understood exactly what they'd witnessed, and weren't inclined to keep it to themselves. I heard fragments of it secondhand for days, a captain mentioning it at a briefing, a lieutenant asking a colleague if the rumors about the Foster woman were true, someone else simply saying my name followed by a low whistle and a shake of the head. I didn't chase any of it down. I didn't need to. The truth, once it starts moving on its own, rarely needs an escort. Ryan's world, meanwhile, was quietly rearranging itself around him. David told me it started small, a fellow lieutenant approaching Ryan at the gym, asking with genuine curiosity rather than malice what it was like being related to Sentinel. Ryan had laughed it off the first time, brushed past it the second, but by the third or fourth mention, something in him had visibly begun to shift. He wasn't used to being the secondary story in his own family. For years, he'd built his entire self-image around being the one who'd chosen the harder path, the one who wore the uniform while everyone else played it safe. And now, piece by piece, that foundation was being quietly dismantled by men who'd actually served alongside the person he'd spent years dismissing as a paper officer. The deeper unraveling came from an unexpected direction. A commander Ryan had once served under a man he deeply respected pulled him aside privately after hearing the story secondhand. David wasn't in the room for that conversation, but he heard enough afterward to understand its shape, that the commander had served in a joint operation years earlier, alongside a task force led in part by an officer known only by a single-word call sign, and that several men in that unit still spoke of her with a kind of reverence Ryan had never once heard directed at himself. The commander hadn't said it to embarrass him. He'd said it, David thought, because he assumed Ryan already knew, and the assumption alone had been its own quiet blow. Ryan began asking around more carefully after that, no longer trying to disprove anything but trying almost desperately to understand how large the world he'd been standing at the edge of actually was. What he found unsettled him in a way I don't think he'd anticipated. It wasn't simply that I'd done more than he knew. It was the scale of what he didn't know, how many people across, how many commands had crossed paths with a version of me he'd never been permitted to see, how many rooms I'd occupied that existed entirely outside the boundaries of his own career, however respectable that career was. For a man who'd spent his life measuring himself against a fixed and knowable scoreboard, discovering that the scoreboard itself was incomplete must have been its own particular kind of vertigo. At the same time, something else was happening quieter and slower within his own family. His parents, who'd spent years gently indulging Ryan's need to be the center of every gathering, began asking me questions of their own, careful, respectful ones. Nothing that pushed against what I couldn't say, but questions nonetheless offered with a kind of new attentiveness I hadn't experienced from them before. His mother told me almost shyly over coffee one afternoon that she felt foolish for never having asked more about my service, for assuming the way people often assume about quiet women that there simply wasn't much to ask about. I told her there was nothing to feel foolish over. I'd built my silence carefully on purpose for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone's failure to notice. Ryan came to see me 2 weeks after the dinner alone without David there to soften whatever was about to happen. He showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The easy swagger gone, replaced by something uncertain and unpracticed. I invited him in. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where David and I had spent so many quiet nights, turning this entire situation over. And for a long moment, Ryan simply stared at his hands, saying nothing at all. "I don't know what to say to you," he finally admitted, and his voice had none of its usual polish. "I spent years thinking I understood exactly where I stood compared to you. Turns out I didn't understand anything." I didn't rush to fill the silence for him. I let him sit in it the way I'd learned to sit in silences far heavier than this one, because I understood that whatever came next needed to come from him unhurried without me softening the shape of it. He looked up at me eventually, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was no performance in his expression at all, just a man confronting plainly how small his understanding of the world had actually been. "I've spent my whole life needing to be the one who did something," he said quietly. "And I never once considered that the person I was competing with might have already done more than I could imagine, and just never felt the need to say so." I studied him for a moment, this man who'd spent years measuring his worth against a woman he'd never bothered to actually know, and felt something soften in me that I hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness yet, that would come later, and it would come on its own terms. But something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The sight of a man finally standing at the edge of a truth he could no longer avoid. Ryan's apology, when it finally came in full, wasn't the kind delivered in a single dramatic sentence. It unfolded slowly over the weeks that followed in small gestures more than grand words. A phone call just to ask how my week had gone and offer to help David fix the fence line behind our house, a quiet correction, when a cousin at a barbecue made an offhand joke about desk jobs that Ryan once would have laughed along with. He didn't announce his change. He simply started behaving like a different man, the way people do when they've actually learned something, rather than merely performed learning it. But there was one conversation that mattered more than the rest, and it happened fittingly at another family dinner, the kind of ordinary Sunday gathering that had once been the site of his cruelest joke. The table was the same, the room was the same, but everything around it had shifted in ways that had nothing to do with furniture. Ryan stood partway through the meal, and for a moment my chest tightened instinctively, some old reflex bracing for another performance. But his face wasn't wearing that expression this time. He looked instead like a man about to do something difficult and necessary, and he began by turning to me directly, rather than to the room at large. "I owe you an apology," he said, "and not just for that comment at dinner all those months ago. I've spent years making you smaller than you are because it made me feel bigger than I was. I didn't know I was doing it, but I was." He paused, and I watched him search for the rest of it, unwilling to let himself off easily. "I'm sorry for every time I made you shrink at your own family's table." I let the words settle before I answered the way I'd learned to let important things settle, rather than rushing to smooth them over. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it fully without reservation. But I wanted him to understand something too, something that mattered more than the apology itself. Respect isn't earned by talking about what you've done. It's earned by staying quiet after you've done it. He nodded slowly, and I saw the words land somewhere real in him, not just as an absolution, but as a lesson he intended to carry forward. Around the table, something had changed in the way everyone was watching us. Not the charged, uncomfortable silence of the gala or the engagement dinner, but something gentler, the quiet attentiveness of a family finally seeing each other clearly. David reached over and took my hand under the table. The same gesture he'd made 100 times before, but it felt different now, lighter, no longer carrying the weight of a secret we had to protect between just the two of us. His parents watched with a kind of quiet pride I hadn't seen from them before, and even Ryan's fiancée, who'd witnessed the worst of it firsthand, offered me a small, warm smile from across the table, one woman to another, acknowledging something that didn't need further explanation. Ryan lifted his glass then, and this time there was nothing performative in the gesture at all. "To my sister-in-law," he said, his voice steady, "the bravest sailor I've ever met." Glasses rose around the table, a soft chorus of agreement, and I felt the years of quiet, necessary silence settle into something that finally felt like being fully seen. I didn't need the toast. I want to be honest about that. I'd built a life that didn't depend on anyone's recognition, because recognition had never been the point of any of it. Not the missions, not the medals gathering dust in a drawer. No one else was cleared to open, not even the call sign that had for one strange season upended an entire family's assumptions about who I was. I'd done the work because it needed doing. And I'd carried the silence because it was the price of doing it honorably. But I won't pretend the toast meant nothing. There is a particular quiet grace in finally being understood by the people who share your table, even when you never ask them to understand you in the first place. Nobody at that dinner asked me how many missions I'd been on, or what exactly Task Group 7 had done, or what Sentinel had really meant to the men and women who'd once depended on it. They didn't need to anymore. They'd learned the hard way, the way families sometimes have to, that some of the strongest people you'll ever know are the ones who never once needed you to know it. I smiled and let the moment be exactly what it was. Not vindication, not victory. Just a family finally standing on solid, honest ground. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you tonight. Leave a comment and tell me what part stayed with you the longest. Stories like Samantha's remind us that real strength rarely announces itself, and that the people we underestimate are often carrying more than we'll ever know. We share stories like this every day, so if you want to make sure you never miss one, go ahead and subscribe. There's always another journey waiting for us to take together.